Hi, and welcome to the Crowdsourcing Sustainability Podcast. My name is Michaela.
And I'm Ryan.
And we're your co-hosts. This podcast exists to help inform, inspire, and empower people to take action on climate. We'll do this by bringing on wonderful sustainability leaders, listening to their stories, and exploring meaningful actions we can all take.
Today we are lucky enough to be with Jill Kubit, the co-founder of Dear Tomorrow, which is a climate legacy storytelling project that I think is very powerful and I'm super excited to dive into. Jill also co-leads the Our Kids' Climate Global Parents Network and has spent 10 years building the labor climate movement. She gives talks on climate and Dear Tomorrow constantly, including some for the UN and a TED Talk, which you should definitely check out, and much, much more. So Jill, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan and Michaela, for having me. This should be fun, I hope.
Of course. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely.
So we'd like to start by hearing more about your climate journey, especially how it started. We're always fascinated to hear people's why they're on this journey. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, when people ask me about my climate journey, I usually start more recently with Dear Tomorrow, but I can go back, dig a little deeper if that's useful.
Definitely.
So I started working on climate in, I don't even remember exactly the year, but like around 2005 or 2006. And climate change was like starting to become a discussion in the public discourse. And it was like a little bit, people were talking about it a little bit. And I learned about it through some of the work that I was doing at Cornell University. I was working with labor unions around, I was doing much more, not outside of the climate movement. I was doing like more education and some organizing work. And there were some trade unionists coming from other countries to the UN to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. And they were looking for people in the US who were in the trade union movement, who were also thinking about like sustainable development, water issues, and climate change. And so I just started, my boss and I at the time started dabbling with this idea of, should we work on climate change? And the more that I learned about it, the more I just kind of became obsessed with the issue. Mm-hmm. I think if I go back even further in my like life's journey or my career journey, when I was growing up, I like never knew what I wanted to do. And when I was in high school, I didn't know like where I wanted to go to college or if I wanted to go to college. When I was in college, I didn't know what my major was going to be. And I had a couple of different careers. I was a teacher at one point. I did Teach for America. And then I was doing work or educating and organizing in the labor movement. But when I really learned about the severity of climate change and the urgency, and this was 15 years ago, I was like, this is the issue that I want to work on. And so I just moved my work I still continue to work at Cornell University, actually here in New York City, but I started doing all of the organizing work around engaging trade union leaders around the transition to a low carbon or zero carbon economy.
And I'm curious before we get into Dear Tomorrow, which I think will be a lot of our conversation here, but how do you see this climate labor movement today? Like, how has it progressed? How important do you think it is in getting the action that we need? I'd love to hear a bit more of your thoughts on this, because I think it's something we don't hear about enough.
Well, if you interviewed me on this topic like 7 years ago, I would be one of the there's like a dozen people in the United States that were like following this issue, and I was one of them. But now I feel a little bit like, oh, I'm so far outside of that conversation. I don't know exactly where it is, but I think some of the early work that we did that at the time seemed so much on the fringe actually is very central to a lot of the work that's going on in the environmental justice movement. So I worked on, back in like 2008, I believe, I worked on a green jobs report for the UN Environment Program. And it was the first report of its kind where we were like, what sectors are going to be affected by transitioning to a low carbon economy? What does that mean for jobs? What does it mean for communities? How do you even define what a job in a zero carbon economy looks like? And like, what is the work going to be for people like moving forward in terms of like decades and centuries? So I think that really looking at that early work was really looking at like, what is the impact that the transition that we have to make? What is that impact that's going to affect workers in extractive industries and in like high carbon intensive industries? And how do we like protect workers to make the transition so that we're not putting like people and their livelihoods up against the necessity that we have in the society to totally transform like our energy and our transportation and our manufacturing systems. And so I think those are that kind of core work around what does a transition look like? What does a just transition look like? What kind of jobs are are important for building back better? Where to invest in the economy? Those are questions that I think are at the heart of some of the organizations like Sunrise Movement and others. But when we were working on it, like nobody was paying attention to that work. So anyway, it's really interesting to see how that's evolved.
Yeah, you were way ahead of the game, because when I think of that now, all I can think about is the Green New Deal and how central it is to combine putting people to work, giving people jobs with climate action. Like the two just go hand in hand so well, but clearly that hasn't been, that's not how most people see it. So it's really awesome that you were one of the pioneers in the US, at least, to get that conversation going. So very appreciative of that. I'd love to dive in deeper now on what you've transitioned to since then. So can you connect the dots for us from that time period to you starting Dear Tomorrow, and kind of what led you to start that in the first place? Like, what was your thought process? What was the self-talk that got you to that point?
Yeah. So, I mean, I loved that work around like working with labor unions and leaders and working with community organizers and environmental justice groups around like what kind of jobs are needed and what is a just transition. But I also felt a frustration with the fact that when I was doing that work, and that work was between, like I said, like around 2005, 2006, I did that until around 2013. I felt like the conversation in the US and also in many other countries really didn't move very much during that time frame. And so I became pretty frustrated with the lack of progress. And I started thinking about how we were engaging people and how we were communicating. It wasn't just like in my own work, but I was like looking around to like, well, how are other organizations communicating? How are like the big NGOs, and how are business leaders communicating, and health advocates? And I found that most of the conversations around climate, when you would like, when I would like organize a panel, or we would have like a roundtable discussion, people would talk about climate change in a very kind of data-driven, fact-based way. And so in the moment, people are like, whoa, this is terrible that it's happening. But then people would walk out of the door and they would kind of like continue on with their own lives. Right. And their like policies weren't changing and opinions really weren't changing. And so I started looking into this question of like, how do people make decisions, and how do you actually make like social and cultural transformative change? And I came across, I've read a ton of social science papers on this, and climate communications papers. And I came across, I just felt like we were doing it in the wrong way. Instead of like talking about it by bringing in like scientists and like policymakers, we needed other creative ways of engaging people, and we needed to like start to like tell stories about people who care about climate change and what people were doing, and we also needed to everybody needed to kind of go through some kind of process of thinking about how climate change or the climate crisis like impacts ourselves and impacts like the people that we love. And so I took a break from that work and I went to graduate school. And when I was at graduate school, I met an amazing woman named Trisha Shrum. And I had just become a parent. So I had this like little child in my life. And I was like looking at him and thinking like, what is this world that we're creating for him? And I met Trisha, and she had a daughter who was 8 months old. And I think when I met her, Gabriel was about a year, like a little bit over a year, maybe a year and a half. And she had this epiphany where she had written a letter to her daughter, Eleanor, to open if in a 50 years time. And in that letter, she wrote about climate change and how she felt about it and what she was doing. And she told me the story about the power of writing this letter. And when I heard this story and I was like in this deep exploration myself, I like it all came together. And I basically decided like when I graduated, I decided to like just do this project full time. Which was pretty crazy because at the time all we had was an idea, a website that we had built, and I had only raised $1,000. And I was like, this is my new job that I gave to myself. And I started working on it. And so she and I worked for about a year and a half together on developing the project, developing the concept, and kind of getting it off the ground. And then Trisha's in academia, so she ended up going the academic route, and I took over the project completely, I'd say in like 2016, and have been building it ever since.
Could you explain a little bit about the specifics of what Dear Tomorrow is and how it works?
Yeah, so I would love to. So Dear Tomorrow is a collection of letters about the climate crisis written to people we love living in the future. And so what we do is we ask people to think about a person that they love. This could be their child or their grandchild. It could be a niece or nephew. It could be another family member. It could even be like, if you're young, it could be yourself in the future. And we ask you to think about that person standing in the year 2050 and having a conversation about what you did today in the year 2020 about the climate crisis. And we ask people to write that letter now. And so people, they share these stories about like what they want the future to look like, what actions they're taking, what like scares them, like what contradictions they feel. But they basically sit down and they write this letter to someone that they love for them to open up in the future. And we find from talking to letter writers that that if you take the project seriously and you actually sit down to do it, it's a very like deep, profound experience to think about climate change in this very personal way.
Yeah, when I first saw or heard about Dear Tomorrow, I was actually immediately hooked by the idea for a lot of the reasons you just said. And it might have been after I read a letter or two, but I was like, this has been missing in the conversation. It really personalizes it. And people can think about it and talk about it in a way that you otherwise wouldn't, because we don't really think about that far into the future or write letters for someone 30 years from now. But I'd love to hear more about what you've found exactly on like what makes this so powerful and moving for people. Just like dive a little deeper on the mechanics of it and any other themes you've seen, or even, I don't know, sharing part of what it was in that first letter that you read with your co-founder, what it was in that really spoke to you. Just, I'd love to hear more about this in detail.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that makes it really powerful is that it's a slow, deep process that I think many other climate organizing like programs don't have. So like when we were just like anecdotally, or when we were like starting to organize this project, everyone was like, nobody is going to write a letter. They're like, you should develop a Twitter campaign. Like, you should get people to write one sentence. You know, nobody is going to like take the time to like sit down and write a letter to someone they love. Like, this goes against like everything that was like existing in the world, which was like big numbers of people and fast and quick and short and easy. And so I think one thing that makes Dear Tomorrow like stand out or different, and it's also why it's a challenging project, I would say, to be the co-founder of, is because it actually is hard to do. It is hard as a parent myself. It is hard to sit down and basically tell the person that you love so much, you love them so much, you want their life to be so good. And if you know about the climate crisis, like you know that the world that we live in now is not the world we're giving to them. So it's really hard to like articulate that and to like write it down and to share that. And I think that is both a challenge, but that is a beauty, because then when people do take the time to work on this project, they spend weeks like reflecting and thinking about it. Like, what would they say? What do they want to say? What do they want their legacy to be? What do they want that like to be remembered about, and to have that person say that they did everything in their power to make sure that they had like a safe and secure future. So it's just then the content that has been developed that we actually get is really different than most work that's out there, I would say. We have stuff that's like very emotional, very beautiful, poetic, very deep. And I would love to see so much more work like this, but the work is slow and the work is hard. But I think it is, but I also think it's profound.
It's definitely a very powerful topic. Really, it makes people become vulnerable and actually have to think about these issues, which I think a lot of people aren't doing in their day-to-day lives, especially if you're not in the climate realm and you're not doing this as your job. So I'm really impressed with the project, and I think this is an amazing way for people to really work through their thoughts and feelings and emotions about the climate crisis.
Jill, do you have any specific stories that come to mind of people who have gone through this, whether they wrote or they made a video, or just like what happened when they shared it? I'd love to hear some real world ripple effects that are happening.
Some anecdotes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let me start by talking about like when I wrote my own letter, because it had a very important, like, it was very important for me. And then I can talk about like some of the things like people have told us like anecdotally, and then maybe I can get into like a little bit around what we're actually able to measure, because that's what a lot of the way that like things are they successful? Is it like, can you tell us like what it changed? And I can get a little bit into like what we're able to do and what we're not able to do.
That sounds perfect, because I've struggled with that aspect myself, kind of quantifying the impact of cultural change, which is just so tricky. But I'd love to hear all of that.
All groups, I would say, that do cultural shift work struggle with these same problems. And so actually for me, the challenge is getting the field to redefine how they think about and measure cultural work, as opposed to making us like fit what we're doing into a box that doesn't work for us.
Right.
But that's a whole nother struggle. That could be like a 1 hour conversation on its own. So for me, it's like I worked in climate for 15 years, and like the first half of it, I did this very important, I think, political work, but in this like very kind of fact-based like communications way. And then I like met Trisha and even myself, I was like, I'm going to ask all these people to write letters, but like, will I actually sit down and write a letter to my own son, who's a baby? And well, what it did for me is it like, for the first time, it took and I talk about this in some of my talks, so you might have heard this, but it took like these years that are very abstract for me, that I've always been like, by the year 2030, these things X, Y, and Z has to happen. And by the year 2050, we have to be like zero net neutral carbon, or whatever language people are using now. But it made those years feel relevant to me. So like at the time when I was like, okay, in 2030, he was basically going to be getting ready to graduate from high school. Like that is a real date. I can imagine this person at a certain age, like in his life. And we have to make all of these changes in the way society is structured when he's in high school. That was like a crazy transition in my own like mind. And then in the year 2050 was basically the year that I was when I was founding Dear Tomorrow. So I was like, we have to completely shift our entire economy and how it is organized, how it is structured, how people live, work, eat. Everything has to be different. And he's going to be my age. And so that to me, like for the first time, it's like, I care tremendously about climate change. I was like obsessed with it, but I didn't actually feel it until I like sat down and I read my letter, or wrote my letter. And so that was like a very important experience for me, in terms of like changing my own thinking. In terms of like, then when I had my letter, and then I found this is within my own like friends and family network, is that I had worked on climate for all these years before, and my parents couldn't describe what I did. And like most of my friends weren't that interested. When I shifted to do this storytelling work was when it opened up my own personal conversations that I was able to have with other people in my life. And my mom is now like a major climate organizer, like in a small town in New Hampshire. It's bizarre, but I think it's like she, for the first time, was then able to say like, I'm thinking about my grandchildren, and I'm thinking about putting solar panels on my rooftop, and I'm thinking about doing an energy audit, and I'm bringing people to my house to get more people to do these things, and I'm starting an organization in my small town, because she also then had like through the lens of Dear Tomorrow, she wrote her own letter and she became activated. And so I saw it like even in my own relationships with people. And so, you know, we've done some surveys and asked people like what they've done and what they've done with it. And, you know, I've had people tell me they wrote a speech for a contest that they never would have done before, and in their high school, and they like won the contest. And then I've had people quit their jobs and decide to like move into the climate change sector and decide that this is like what they wanted to do. And these are all kind of extreme of like really, really activating people to be advocates and to be like lifelong advocates on climate. And then I think there's just like a lesser version of that, which is like, now I have my story, I can talk to my friends and family more easily. Or if I'm like, you know, if am writing a speech on this topic, I'm like, I feel comfortable because I know what my story is and I can share that story. And that story is more powerful now that I've personalized it. And so those are a couple of experiences, I would say. You know, we've also had like groups of people do the project. So I've had like community organizers or church leaders or, NGO leaders who have said that like they did this project with 10 of their top staff and organizers. And it like shifted the mood in the room when everyone read their letter, and like it gave people like more voice and more power to like continue the work they were already doing. And I just think that for me, it's all about empowering people to tell the story of the climate crisis in a meaningful way that then connects to other people. The other people are more open to listen to because it is a personal story.
That is amazing. I think you're spot on. It makes it real in a way that most other things haven't, because climate's still thought of as distant in most people's minds. I believe,
Yeah, I
both
totally
in.
agree. It's still like one of the most challenging things, and this is like why Dear Tomorrow exists, is that we have this this psychological distance or this time lag problem. Whereas like the psychological distance is that like it feels like it's happening to somebody else, or it's happening somewhere else, or somebody in far off in the future that like I'm not going to be around to see this, so it's fine. I'll carry on my life and we'll carry on the way things are because it doesn't impact me. And
Yeah.
then with similarly, the time lag problem is like there's this huge delay between like our actions and the effects, and
Hmm.
this is like a natural part of the climate crisis. So even though communities are being impacted now, it's still much worse in the future if we do not transform our economies. Um, so it's just we're dealing with this distance that people feel and this problem of time, and this is like inherently part of the climate crisis, and that's I think why it makes it such a difficult problem to crack. It's also what makes it so interesting to me because it is such a challenge.
Yeah, and I feel like it's also a challenge for a lot of people to see because climate isn't always a tangible physical thing that
Mm-hmm.
you can see right in front of you. Climate's often something that you can't just point to and you can't feel and you can't see. It's often something that is going on constantly and constantly changing. And I feel like the letters really help put a tangible thing and a physical thing that people can look at and point to and actually think like, oh, this is climate change. This is what it is. It's not just the physical stuff, it's also the emotions behind it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also very powerful because, and maybe this is all just intertwined with what you just said, Michaela, and Jill, what you've been saying, but it makes starting the conversation on climate, which is typically uncomfortable, and we have this whole culture of, climate silence, but it makes starting the conversation, after you write the letter and share it, you're probably going to talk about it at least a little bit with some people. It makes starting that conversation come from a place of love. And I think that alone is going to grab people's attention as you start that conversation.
No, yes, I totally agree.
Yeah, it feels like, it feels like it's kind of obvious based on what you've been saying, but it's also just so powerful because we don't often talk about that kind of stuff in general, I think. And then, especially with climate, all you typically hear about are the facts and the figures, and you don't get this storytelling or personalization of it. So I think that's fantastic. I would love to maybe not do a deep dive, but hear a bit more about how you think about cultural work in the climate space. Uh, just just because I've been grappling with this myself, and maybe it'll help some people to better understand why this space is important and maybe how to think about it a bit better. Because you said you want to kind of reimagine how we think about this type of work specifically because it doesn't fit into the typical mold. So, as someone who's been thinking about this for a really long time, I'd love to hear your quick take, at least, on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many directions we could go with this conversation in this direction. I mean, most obvious, the first thing that kind of comes to mind is that we were talking about this before, is that climate change doesn't feel tangible. It feels like invisible. And I used to say like climate change is this invisible backdrop to which we're all living our lives. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're going through our day. Many people, especially those, let's like specify, many people in developed countries, like kind of go about their day-to-day lives, and this is obviously been shifted by COVID, but like we're going about our lives without really thinking about the climate crisis, which is the biggest issue that we face as a civilization in all of human history. And yet we don't see it. We just we're going about, we go to our jobs, we take our kids to school, we like cook dinner, put food on the table, we go shopping, we travel, we struggle to get by. I mean, we are living like very kind of in this like short-termism, like day to day, whereas like climate change or the climate crisis is this like huge global problem. And because it's largely invisible, we don't see it in our own lives, and we have no. This is slightly changing, I would say. As I'm saying this, it is slightly changing. But in the past, I would say until like 2018, there were no signs. You could go up through your entire day or entire week without any signs that the climate crisis was happening. You wouldn't talk to anybody about it. There was nothing in the street, like on your way to work about it. If you didn't work on it, you weren't hearing about it at work. You weren't hearing about it anywhere, and you weren't seeing it anywhere. You weren't seeing the solutions, and you weren't seeing the problems. And so it was largely this like kind of invisible thing. And then I think what the cultural work that I've been trying to build is basically like signs and signals that, one, we're living through this like great existential threat, and two, we're trying to do something about it, and we need to have visible signs that this is happening. So I'm super interested in like films about it, and it being integrated into TV shows, and there being like books, many more books written about the topic, and poems and short stories. And we're actually starting to see that. I'm starting to see that in kind of the climate cultural space, but I think it's like in a very nascent stage. I would also say it's not integrated into other things in a way that it still feels very separate. Like if you want to go to a film about climate change, it's about climate change. Instead of being like, you went to this film, it was a love story, and the mom happens to install solar panels, and like that's like a one sentence like description or an image that you see in the film, but it's not the central theme, so that you're exposing people who might be resistant to it to these signals that this is the where we're living. So I'm like super interested in like the kind of arts and cultural sector. And then even more so digging deeper than that, because there's a need for people who create to just like create art and create stories, and create any media about this. I think there's also a role for those of us in the trenches who are like really working on climate change to use creativity and culture in our own work, and like integrate this work into our engagement work, and to design engagement tools that actually are creative in nature. And that's kind of where Dear Tomorrow fits. It fits in this like Dear Tomorrow is a tool that people, individuals or organizations or groups of people can use to deepen engagement and on the climate crisis, and then to share like those stories with other people around them in their communities.
And you kind of building off that, you recently had an exhibit for, I think it was the audio of a lot of these stories you've collected. Can you tell us
Before
a bit
COVID.
About that? Before COVID,
we had pivoted and moved into doing public installations, and yeah, I would love to talk about it. I love the doing like art and installation work, but basically like we had like one of my challenges or struggles is that I have so much content. Mm-hmm. And I'm always like looking for places where this content can live, and how do I actually share the content in creative ways and in new ways. And so in 2019 in the summer, I was invited by the Human Impacts Institute to be an artist in residence, which I was like, I'm not an artist, I'm an organizer, but I had this art project. So it was this amazing opportunity that they invited me to be an artist in residence. And I worked with the director of that program, and a sound designer, like a very talented sound artist, on creating like an installation. And we were out on Governor's Island, and the Human Impacts Institute had a house out there on Governor's Island, and we had an entire room where you would walk into the room and you could read people's letters, and you could hear the voices of some of the people who had participated in the project. And in order to design that, I worked to curate the entire collection, and we picked 50 of the letters, and invited the letter writers to send in an audio recording. And we had a really short like turnaround, and I was basically like emailing people who had written letters, like, some had written letters like 6 months ago, some of them had written like 4 years ago, and I was like, do you want to be part of an installation? If so, can you send your audio recording like in like, a week? Because we have to get it all together amongst these things. And within 24 hours, I had like more than half of the people had responded being like, I love this project. I still think about it. I will do it. I'm so excited to be included. And so I think in the end, we had 34 of the 50 people sent in their audio, and then we did a physical installation of the 50 letters, plus including like 34 of the audio. And when the thing about it is, when you walked into the room, you basically, like, there were 4 speakers, and different voices were coming from different speakers. And at some of the times, they're like, you would just hear like one letter, and it would be, or an excerpt from a letter. So sometimes you would walk in and there would just be like one voice telling their story or sharing their letter. And then other times you would have this compilation of like different voices on the same topic, kind of saying similar things, but coming from different parts of the room. And I don't know, it was amazing. And I have big plans to continue to do that, but not until 2021.
So I know you mentioned COVID a few times. Could you explain how your work has changed since COVID has broken out, and like how Dear Tomorrow has shifted and pivoted around COVID?
Yeah, good question. So I had briefly mentioned, I think, that like we had moved in this direction in 2019. We moved in this direction of doing public installations, and also we had moved in the direction of doing public workshops. So in 2020, our plan for 2020 was to do community-led public engagement in physical spaces, either in like groups of people coming together to write a workshop, or in installations. And I had discussions, or was like already slated for like several universities, major conferences, and when COVID hit, it just, everything was like that. Obviously, we were not going to do this public project, this like out into the world public project, and so we reverted back to we already had this great digital project. We basically made this. We had to make this pivot of like, we're not doing our like public engagement programming in the public. We're going to move back to being a digital project. I would say, though, that one of the challenges and one of the decisions that I made kind of early on with COVID is that I stopped asking people to write letters for a good like 3 months, because I felt and I really felt deeply that like in the moment of a crisis, and many people, like people all over the world, were like in crisis mode of like, do I still have a job? How am I going to educate my kid at home? How am I going to educate them and work? How am I going to pay the bills? Like, where am I going to live? And like, is it safe to go outside? Is my family member sick? People had these, am I going to get sick? People had these like very immediate like needs, and issues and concerns, and it was not the moment to have this existential like thought process of like, what are you going to do about the climate crisis? So we like pulled, we pulled like our digital projects as well for the first couple of months, because it just did not feel like it's not the moment to do deep reflective work when people are really dealing with like the immediate here and now.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we did that. And then the work has started picking up this summer. And one last thing I would say is like, what we decided to do then was focus internally on our processes. So we spent the summer like rewriting, revamping our toolkit, so that the resources available for people when they are ready to organize again, they're stronger materials, and they also provide options for people to organize in like a purely digital format, and in the future they can do like in-person format. And so anyway, I had two amazing interns that helped me this summer kind of rework that, and that was I'm really happy that we did that.
That's great. We're definitely going to have to link to that toolkit and some of these audio files so people can listen in and hear what the exhibit was like earlier. Was it this year that you had it, or was it last year?
It was last September and October.
Okay, cool. So I know we're running a bit short on time here, and there's so much more to talk about. So I'm going to try to do some rapid fire-ish questions here.
I'll try and be more succinct.
Oh no, I'm
not that succinct. Sorry.
One thing we haven't touched on yet, which I would love to, is you've also co-founded this global network of climate parent organizations, Our Kids' Climate Work. I'd love for you to just speak about that. Oh, sorry, Our Kids' Climate.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to speak on that at least just a little bit, and hear what you're up to, what you're excited about, the impact. And I'm kind of piggybacking here, but I don't know, how old is Gabriel?
He just turned 7, which is like terrible. Okay. I'm like, oh my God, time is going by so fast. We are not making the changes we need to. Like, we are making progress, but it is not accelerating at the pace that needs to happen.
It's not nearly fast enough. But I'd love to also, for any parents out there, touch upon how you think about talking to kids about this issue. And I know he's very young, but have you talked to him about this yet? Or have you thought about how to bring it up? I'd love to hear about all of that kind of lumped into one.
Okay. Which one do you want to do first?
Let's start with Gabriel and then move on to Our Kids' Climate.
Okay. So I've been talking to Gabriel about climate change since he learned to talk. But I'm not talking about like the scary climate change, like the earth is burning, like your future is doomed kind of discussions. And I think when people think about climate change and like having the conversation, they think, whoa, like this is such a scary topic. Like, I don't know how to do this. I'm just not going to do it at all. But I've been talking to him like since he was born, basically. And I think about it a little differently, I think, than what you would typically think about, like when you're talking to kids about climate. I would categorize the conversations into 4 pieces. The first is that we talk about nature. We talk about the plants and the animals and the importance of trees, and we take walks in the park, and even like, we go, if we're in a playground, we see like a plant that's like somehow living. We talk about like living things. And we talk about it, like we talk just about really just about the importance of nature and around protecting nature. And I've been doing that since he was very, very young. The second thing I talked to him about, that since he was very young, is that we talk about solutions. So that means like walking down the street and seeing solar panels on the rooftop and pointing it out and being like, that is a solution for your future. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that beautiful? I love that. Or like, like taking the train and saying like, this is obviously pre-COVID, but the train is low carbon. It's good for the world. People should take the train. Like, and just saying like how great trains are, or the bus, or like pointing out windmills. There's lots and lots of things you can like point to and say like, we need more of that. Isn't that beautiful? We need more of that. That is showing that people care about your future, and inserting that into conversation. So he knows a lot about climate solutions, more. He knows way more about climate change and climate solutions than like any 7-year-old on the planet. But that I think is that's something that people can talk about without it being big and scary. The third thing I talk about, and this is like also more in our actions, is that we go to rallies and marches on not just on climate. We went to Black Lives Matter, and we talk about the importance of people using their voice, and that people are powerful when they are determined to do something and to change something that is wrong. And that is a climate solution, is like using your voice, voting. I take them with me to vote. So we do all that kind of like civic engagement work, kind of wrapped up into like climate solutions without it being specifically about climate.
Yeah.
Just this idea that like groups of people can come together around a cause and make the world better. And then the fourth thing that I talk about, which is probably like more controversial and like fewer people do, is we talk about consumption. So we talk about like the fact that the world does not have an endless supply of things, and that like we don't get every physical item that we want in the world. And we model that through, and this makes me kind of like a Scrooge, I would maybe, but like we model that like at like birthday parties, like we tell people like, don't bring gifts, and like we don't have goodie bags, and we don't like, we bring like reusable bags and reusable mugs, and like we try and instill in him this idea that like the things we have are really important, but we don't need everything, and we can't actually have everything, and we don't need everything to live a good, fulfilled, happy life. And part of the reason I do this is because I think we are in for some big changes in the way that the world is structured, and I don't want him to grow up and think like, oh, it used to be so great. We had all this stuff that we had, and now we have none of it. Instead, I want him to be like, we did fun activities as a family, and we took bike rides, and we like went to the beach, and we like hung out with our friends, and remembering like the things and experiences that we did, and make that stuff very powerful, as opposed to like the things that we may not have sometime down the line. That I expect that we will not have the kind of like consumption that in the future that we have today.
I am so glad I asked that. I feel like a lot of parents are going to find that super useful.
Yeah, and actually, so I'm experimenting with this stuff along the way. There are a couple of great resources. A good friend of mine and another climate parent named Harriet Sugarman came out with a book just this year called How to Talk to Your Kids About Climate Change that I highly recommend. I believe it's the first book on the topic ever published. And then another colleague of mine who is in Sweden is actually in the process of publishing the second book on this topic. And that is going to be eventually, it'll be in Swedish, but it'll be translated and distributed globally, I think, probably in winter of 2021. Awesome. But there's kind of and then maybe this is a good segue into the Our Kids Climate Network, but there are some really amazing leaders like around the globe that are thinking about these questions, thinking about like, how do we activate and engage parents? How do we provide like the tools and resources for people to organize, to talk to their own kids, to create like action and help transform their schools. And so I'm really, really fortunate that I get to kind of help build that project called Our Kids Climate. And it's so half of my life is like around like building Dear Tomorrow, and then related to that, because Dear Tomorrow is very much a legacy project and is using love and emotion. I've also become very involved in helping to grow this emerging group of parent organizations and parent leaders in many countries.
Yeah. So tell us more about Our Kids Climate and just what y'all are up to, the impact of the work, and how parents or grandparents can plug in if they're interested.
Yeah. So Our Kids Climate is started about 5 years ago, and I met like the group of like founding members. My colleague Frida was like the original founder, and I never know what to say. Like my title is I'm like co-lead, I'm co-founder, and it's like not quite sure. But about 5 years ago, she put out this call to organizations like around the globe, like who is organizing with a parental lens? Are there any groups out there? And at the COP in Paris, they basically pulled together a meeting, and they think there were like at the time there were 12 organizations around the globe that we could find that like did this kind of any kind of like family friendly organizing, parent led engagement, or legacy framing like organizing. And then after that meeting, so like there were 12 groups kind of came together. I think we were about 8 countries, mostly from the US and Europe. After that meeting, we kind of all went back to our home countries and worked on worked on our own projects. And then in summer of 2018, we decided we would start to relaunch that project. And then the IPCC came out in 2018, and obviously like the kids movement, Greta became like a household name. And so we officially relaunched in spring of 2019. And since then, since spring of 2019, or since like the founding, we're 56 groups from 18 countries currently. And the role of Our Kids Climate is not to like set the agenda and to like say like this is what everyone should do. The role is to say like how can we support these emerging organizations that are like totally new and trying to figure out like how do you organize, how do you mobilize people, how do you engage people. And so I would say we do 3 things. We support groups. We support new leaders and new groups through, we run training programs, we do one-on-one mentorship, and we also provide small grants, like we call them micro grants, to groups that like they need $1,000 to make a video, or like $300 to make flyers or print t-shirts or a banner or art supplies. They can come to us for like micro grants, and we distribute them. And then, so that's the first thing, is like we support them. The second one is that we connect them. We are trying to develop relationships between organizers and organizations in different countries so that they can share ideas and build off each other and start campaigns like across locations, or just say like there's a really successful campaign happening in India, like can somebody in New Zealand also get involved in the same project? So we're doing that. And then the third thing we do is try and amplify the parent voice. So really thinking about what is unique about being the parent and what is the parent's voice in the climate crisis. And I think it's really about this like deep love we have for our children, and this connection that we have between generations that we hold, that like connects like the youth movement to adults. Adults are decision makers in the world, and many parents are also decision makers. They vote, they're voting members, they run organizations, run governments. Many of those people in high position a high position of power. I didn't say that right, whatever. They are also parents. And so it's like, how do we engage people in this like direct kind of emotional plea to them, as opposed to being like why you should do it. You should do this. We should make these transitions because you are personally impacted, because this is about your children or about your grandchildren. So we spend a lot of time on thinking about like using that voice and the power of that voice.
That's awesome. Well, we will definitely link to that as well, so anyone interested can learn more and get involved. So last few questions here. One is a bit of a pivot, but I really wanted to ask it to you and hear what you had to say, because I think you'll have a interesting or insightful take on this. And so basically, a lot of people fall into this trap of thinking that they're just one person and can't do anything worthwhile to move the needle on this very overwhelming climate emergency. And I'm wondering what you would say to people who are feeling that way.
What to say? I mean, I think this is the question that people come to us all the time, and they're like, doesn't matter if I do anything. Do my actions matter? Does like it, why does it matter? And I think, I mean, there's a couple of different like directions we could go, but I really think that like we have to understand that social movements, or like the cultural change, the political change, like the big kind of systems change, like the policy change that we want, it doesn't just happen out of thin air. Like it happens because lots of people are acting a certain way or demanding something. And then when there's enough people who are doing those things, then businesses will like respond, or governments will respond. And so there's like there is a direct link between the individual action and the political action. And it's not because the individual action like is enough to like actually do something to like reduce emissions and to like solve the climate crisis, but it's because we are fundamentally social beings, that like the way that we act, we all like to pretend that we're like individual thinkers, and we're all original, but the reality is we're all social beings. We do things that are like people in our lives. We do things like our friends and family. We do things like other people in our community. We do things that are like acceptable social norms. And so the more that people are taking actions and demonstrating or talking about those actions, and showing other people that they're doing it, the more we can accelerate that lots of people will do them. And that's when you see like that's when you create the space for big changes. They don't exist like apart from each other. And I think that we need to do a much better job of linking the two.
I think it's definitely
that's what I would say. I would also tell people that like you're not going to convince you're not going to convince somebody you don't know. You're not going to convince a denier. You're not going to convince like your uncle. You don't actually need to like convince everyone, but you do have a powerful influence over the people in your immediate circle. And that's like your family members, your close friends, and you have to like use the power within your own kind of networks to like influence your other networks. So I think that's where people have power.
That's such a great point. Do you have any call to action for the listeners? Anything that you want them to know will make a difference? And like, what's a key takeaway?
Write a letter. The call to action is to sit down, take the time, reflect on what climate change means in your own life and to the people that you love, people that are closest to you, and sit down and write a letter, and then to like share that letter. I say that's my that's my call to action. I think when we started this work, people were like, that's not an action. Talking about climate change is not an action, sharing a story, that's not an action. And people were really looking at like political mobilizations and voting. Those are like specific actions. But I actually think that like the deep level work that is needed is like being intentional and being reflective about our own actions, and the letter is a possibility to do that.
One more question for you, actually a couple more, and then we'll call it. But
like skip.
So I'm curious, this weaves in well to what you just were talking about, but do you have any tips for people on talking to people in your network, friends, family, colleagues, on how to actually talk about climate change and weave that into conversations, and just any strategy or examples, tips that you have for folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've covered it, but I've covered some of it, but I can like synthesize it a little bit. I would say three things that think about when you're talking about the issue. One, and I just talked about this, is like talk to the people you know, influence the people that you know. There's this concept in climate communications called the trusted messenger that people use. If you're in the field, you would know what this is, but it's basically this simple idea that like people, they believe like the people that they know, or they trust the people that they know on climate. And so it's simple to simplify that. It's basically like your friends and family will listen to you more than a stranger will listen to you, and you have influence over them. So it's like engage your immediate circle, and think about yourself as a communicator and as having the power and the ability to help shape other people's thoughts and actions, because that's a power that you have. The second one is to speak from the heart, is to really think about why you care about this issue. You can write a letter and or not, and then, but like really, really think about like why you care about this, and figure out what that is, and then be prepared to like talk about climate change, about what you care, whatever it is that you care about, but talk about it in that language. Don't be overly complex. You don't need to know everything, all the latest like scientific data. You just need to like know enough, and you need to be able to like speak from the heart. And I think the third one is to listen. And there's some good resources out there, I think, that also talk about this importance of listening. But really listen to what other people care about, and then connect this to climate. And I would recommend Climate Outreach as a good source. They had a project on how to talk to your friends and family about climate change. And then Catherine Hayhoe has done some really great talks on this topic.
Awesome. Those sound really useful. And we'll make sure to link so folks can find some of that more easily. So very last thing is, if listeners want to learn more about you or follow your work, where should they go, and what can they do? Aside from writing a letter, everyone should 100% write a letter.
You just go to the site and read other people's letters, and it's deartomorrow.org. So you can go to deartomorrow.org and you can write your own letter. You can find the toolkit, and if you wanted to organize, and you can also just take some time and read through what other people are saying or other people are writing about. So there's that. And then also you can follow us on Instagram. We're at Dear Tomorrow on Instagram. And those are like the best places, I think, for right now to follow us. We're also on Facebook, but we're less active on Facebook. But we're also Dear Tomorrow on Facebook. You can check us out there.
Amazing. Well, Jill, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I think people are going to have a lot of useful takeaways from this convo and some good homework to do.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you for asking actually really great questions. And it was knowing enough about me that you could ask a whole range of questions. That's good.
Thank you so much for coming on today and answering our questions. I really had such a great time speaking with you and hearing your thoughts. So thank you.
So that is the end of our show. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed this conversation, you may also appreciate signing up for the Crowdsourcing Sustainability newsletter that I write most weeks. This will also give you access to our CS Slack community. And there's a link to that in the show notes, along with several other links we referred to today. Lastly, please do consider giving us a review to help us grow this community and get this information out to more people. We would really, really appreciate that. And I think that is all we've got for you today. So thank you again. Take care, and we'll talk to you soon. 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 And we'll talk to you soon.